February 23, 1943. Luftwaffe Base Morozovskaya, 40 kilometers west of the Donets River. Oberst Friedrich Hartmann stood before a room of exhausted fighter pilots, their faces gaunt from 3 weeks of interrupted sleep. Behind him, reconnaissance photographs showed Soviet supply lines impossibly intact despite nightly bombing runs. The chalk marks on the operations board told the story. 11 ammunition depots destroyed in the past month, 4 fuel storage facilities obliterated, 3 command posts reduced to rubble. All by aircraft that should not have been capable of reaching their targets, much less returning. Gentlemen, we are being harassed by women flying crop dusters. Hartmann's words drew weary laughter from the assembled pilots. Hauptmann Klaus Steiner, a veteran with 19 confirmed kills, lit a cigarette and leaned back in his chair. Herr Oberst, with respect, these are training biplanes from 1928. Wood and canvas. They have no radios, no navigation equipment, no defensive armament. My grandmother could shoot one down with a hunting rifle. More laughter. These Soviet witches, as the men call them, are flying antiquated machines that belong in aviation museums, not combat zones. Give us 1 week of focused operations, and we'll sweep them from the sky. Officers nodded, raised their coffee cups in mock toasts to the impending victory. Someone suggested they'd need to paint broomsticks on their fuselages to commemorate the kills. What Oberst Hartmann didn't know was that, at that precise moment, 5,000 meters above his airfield, Senior Lieutenant Nadezhda Popova had just completed her 14th bombing run of the night. She was 21 years old, a navigation instructor from Donetsk, who had volunteered the day Germany invaded. By dawn, she would complete 4 more missions, bringing her total for that single night to 18, a record that would stand throughout the entire war. This was mission 307 of what would eventually become 852 combat sorties, more than any other female pilot in history, and more than most male pilots would survive. She had already dropped 43 tons of explosives on German positions, survived 6 direct fighter intercepts, landed twice with her aircraft so riddled with bullet holes that ground crews counted rather than repaired them, and once glided 5 kilometers with a dead engine to reach Soviet lines. Within 24 hours, the ammunition dump adjacent to Hartmann's headquarters would erupt in a fireball visible from 30 kilometers away. Set ablaze by 2 50-kilogram bombs Popova would release at exactly 0347 hours on her 6th run of the following night. German night-air defense doctrine, perfected since 1939, represented the culmination of 200 years of Prussian military engineering philosophy. Overwhelming technological superiority married to ruthless efficiency. The evolution began during the Battle of Britain, where Luftwaffe night fighters learned through catastrophic losses that darkness was as deadly to the hunter as the hunted. In the winter of 1940, 14 pilots died from exposure when their open cockpit aircraft failed in sub-zero temperatures at altitude. By spring 1941, all night fighters featured enclosed heated cockpits with oxygen systems. That summer, Operation Barbarossa revealed new horrors. 23 aircraft were lost to mid-air collisions during night operations, pilots unable to see each other or coordinate intercepts. Solution: mandatory radio communication systems, standardized frequencies, ground-controlled approach protocols. By 1942, analysis showed 30% of night fighter casualties were preventable deaths from failed emergency procedures. Response: mandatory parachutes, survival training, beacon systems. The doctrine crystallized around one immutable requirement: minimum speed of 180 miles per hour to ensure survivability, maneuverability, and intercept capability. The Junkers Ju-88 night fighter embodied this perfection. 300 miles per hour maximum speed. 4-man crew with specialized roles: pilot, radio operator, navigator, gunner. FUG-220 Liechtenstein radar capable of detecting bombers at 4 kilometers. Twin BMW 801 radial engines generating 2,400 combined horsepower. Armament: 3 20mm cannons, 3 13mm machine guns. The Ju-88 had destroyed 357 British bombers between 1940 and 1942. This confidence was not arrogance. It was earned through German blood, German engineering, German victories. While German engineers perfected these requirements, Nadezhda Popova was proving them irrelevant. On November 8, 1942, she approached a German artillery position near Krimskaya, with no radio to coordinate with her squadron, no parachute because the PO-2 flew too low for one to deploy, at 94 miles per hour in an aircraft constructed primarily of plywood and linen fabric. Her navigator, Katya Ryabova, crouched in the rear cockpit with a stopwatch and a hand-drawn map, signaling turns by tapping Popova's shoulder because they couldn't hear each other over the wind. They dropped 4 bombs by hand, pulled the release cables manually, banked away at an altitude of 600 meters, while German anti-aircraft fire turned the sky into a lattice of tracer rounds. The mission succeeded. The artillery position burned. This was mission 143 of what would eventually become 852. German intelligence reports from that sector noted unexplained losses and possible partisan sabotage because the idea that a woman in a wooden biplane had accomplished this was literally not considered as a possibility. The Soviet response violated every principle German doctrine had established through 4 years of aerial warfare. The Polikarpov PO-2 was not designed as a military aircraft. It was a primary trainer, created in 1928 to teach teenage students basic flight principles. Its construction was agricultural-grade wood held together with fabric and piano wire, what mechanics called flying kindling or plywood with wings. In winter, the open cockpit became a torture device. At altitude, temperatures dropped to -40 degrees Celsius. Pilots suffered severe frostbite on their faces, hands, feet. Their breath formed ice crystals on their eyelashes, temporarily blinding them. One pilot reported her urine froze before hitting the cockpit floor. The aircraft had no equipment whatsoever. No radios meant hand signals between aircraft, navigators memorizing routes, pilots operating in complete communication isolation. No parachutes because at the PO-2's operating altitude of 500 to 800 meters, a parachute wouldn't deploy before impact. No armor plating because adding weight would reduce the already pathetic payload capacity. No instruments beyond a compass, altimeter, and airspeed indicator. The specifications read like a joke compared to German night fighters. Maximum speed, 94 miles per hour, exactly half the German minimum requirement. Engine, single 100 horsepower M11 5-cylinder radial, 1/24th the power of a Ju-88. Age designed 15 years before the war, older than the women flying it. Cost $5,000 versus $80,000 for a German night fighter. Production time 3 weeks versus 3 months. The absurdity was complete. The Soviet Union was sending young women into combat in wooden crop dusters converted to bombers, where they dropped explosives by hand while exposed to machine gun fire, sub-zero temperatures, and enemy fighters that could fly 3 times faster. What German engineers saw as fatal weaknesses, Nadezhda Popova transformed into tactical advantages that redefined the meaning of aerial warfare. The PO-2's primitive simplicity enabled a 4-minute refueling process. Ground crew rolled fuel drums to the aircraft, hand-pumped 20 gallons into the tank, and the pilot was airborne again. Rearming took 3 minutes. Navigators loaded 650-kilogram bombs into the external racks while pilots checked control surfaces. A complete turnaround from landing to takeoff, 7 minutes. German bombers required 40 minutes minimum, often over an hour. This speed differential was how Popova flew 18 missions in a single night on February 23, 1943. Land at 21:47 hours, airborne at 21:54. Land at 23:12. Airborne at 23:19. 6 cycles before midnight, 12 more before dawn, each sortie carrying 200 kilograms of high explosive, enough to destroy a supply truck, collapse a trench system, ignite an ammunition stack. The wood and canvas construction that looked so vulnerable possessed a paradoxical resilience. Bullets passed through fabric without triggering explosions, unlike metal aircraft where rounds ricocheted inside fuselages until finding fuel tanks or crew. On March 7, 1943, Popova landed with 24 bullet holes in her aircraft. Ground crews counted them like grotesque decorations. The fabric wings looked like Swiss cheese. One round had passed between her left arm and torso, close enough that she felt the heat. Another had destroyed her airspeed indicator, forcing her to fly by instinct for 4 more runs. She refused to stand down, flew 6 more missions that night. When mechanics asked how she survived, she said, "If I'd been flying one of their metal coffins, that bullet would have ricocheted until it found me." Germans designed aircraft to fight their war. We designed tactics to fight ours. An official Luftwaffe technical assessment dated December 15, 1942, from the Reichsluftfahrtministerium concluded the following. Soviet deployment of female pilots in obsolete training aircraft represents desperate measure indicative of critical personnel and manufacturing deficiencies. Analysis indicates severe pilot shortage compelling utilization of inadequately trained women in combat roles. Deployment of PO2 training aircraft in bombing operations demonstrates declining manufacturing capacity and inability to produce modern combat aircraft in sufficient quantities. Technical evaluation confirms wooden construction, primitive equipment, and absence of defensive armament render these aircraft extremely vulnerable to all forms of anti-aircraft fire and fighter interception. Fundamental physics remain immutable. Speed, metal construction, and modern engineering will always defeat slow, wooden, obsolete designs. Operational projection. Soviet night harassment operations will cease within 4 to 6 months due to unsustainable attrition rates. Mathematical analysis supports this conclusion. Ju-88 advantages include 3-to-1 speed ratio, 24-to-1 horsepower differential, 15-to-1 cost efficiency and combat effectiveness. Current assessment. Temporary morale impact only through sleep disruption of forward personnel. No serious operational threat to supply infrastructure or strategic capabilities. Recommendation. Monitor situation but do not prioritize development of special countermeasures. Standard night fighter protocol sufficient to neutralize threat once dedicated resources allocated. These aircraft pose no significant danger to Reich military operations. This assessment carried the full authority of Reichsluftfahrtministerium and represented the consensus of Germany's premier aeronautical engineers. It was wrong. While German High Command dismissed the threat, Nadezhda Popova was systematically dismantling their supply infrastructure with the precision of a surgeon and the persistence of a metronome. On December 18, 1942, 3 days after that assessment was published, she destroyed an ammunition train near Kushchevskaya. The explosion so massive it was recorded by seismographs 120 kilometers away. On December 22nd, a fuel depot at Tikhoretsk. On December 29th, a forward command post housing 17 officers, killing 12 including a colonel responsible for artillery coordination across the entire sector. By this point she had conducted over 320 missions, rapidly approaching the 852 that would eventually make her one of the most decorated pilots in Soviet military history. German logistics officers were recording unexplainable losses that directly contradicted the assessment's confident predictions. Supply requisitions increased 40%. Replacement requests for destroyed equipment flooded command channels. Frontline units reported chronic shortages of ammunition, fuel, food. And every night, the sound of small biplane engines overhead, irregular and impossible to predict, driving men to exhaustion through systematic sleep deprivation. The Germans had made a fatal calculation error, and the mistake was rooted not in prejudice or arrogance but in sound aerodynamic principles that simply did not account for an aircraft that violated those principles' foundational assumptions. Their logic appeared mathematically unassailable. Ju-88 maximum speed of 300 miles per hour versus PO2 maximum speed of 94 miles per hour equals a speed advantage of 3.2 to 1. In pursuit scenarios, this should guarantee easy interception and destruction. A faster aircraft always catches a slower aircraft given sufficient time and airspace. This is basic physics. What they critically, catastrophically overlooked was that interception does not merely require exceeding an enemy's speed. It requires matching an enemy's speed long enough to establish a firing solution, maintain weapons track, and deliver lethal fire. Here the aerodynamic paradox emerged. Stall speeds. Every aircraft has a minimum speed below which it can no longer generate sufficient lift to remain airborne. The wings stop functioning. The aircraft drops from the sky like a brick. For the Ju-88, this threshold was approximately 120 miles per hour. Below that speed, the aircraft entered an unrecoverable stall and crashed. Pilots approached this limit with terrified respect because it meant death. The POW-2 operated comfortably at 80 miles per hour in level flight and could glide at 60 miles per hour with its engine completely off. The POW-2 flew below the German minimum survivable speed. This created an impossible scenario for German pilots. They could fly past the POW-2 at high speed, overshooting their target with no time to fire. Or they could attempt to slow down to match speeds, which meant deliberately approaching their own stall speed, inducing wing shudder and loss of control, and risking catastrophic death with every passing second. There was no middle ground. There was no solution. On September 14, 1942, near Stalingrad, Hauptmann Werner Schmidt attempted to intercept a PO-2 that had just bombed a fuel depot adjacent to his squadron's airfield. Schmidt was a skilled pilot with 27 kills, a recipient of the Iron Cross First Class, a man who understood his aircraft's capabilities intimately. He made his approach from superior altitude, diving to build speed, positioning for a textbook stern attack. The PO-2 pilot detected his approach, possibly by the sound of his engines or simply by instinct developed through previous encounters. She immediately throttled her engine to minimum power and descended to treetop level. Schmidt followed, reducing speed to 130 miles per hour to avoid overshooting. The PO-2 dropped to 70 miles per hour, gliding more than flying, appearing to float above the ground like a ghost. Schmidt reduced further to 125 miles per hour. His aircraft began to shudder. The stick grew sluggish. Warning bells sounded in his cockpit. He was 15 miles per hour above stall speed with a target flying 20 miles per hour below his minimum. He attempted one more pass, reducing to 120 miles per hour, but his wings began to wobble and drop. He either abandoned the attack or died in a stall-induced crash. He chose survival. His after-action report contained one line: target speed below minimum engagement threshold. The phrase appeared in dozens of similar reports over the following months. Luftwaffe Command initially suspected pilot error or cowardice. Eventually, reluctantly, they understood the physics. Understanding this physics made Nadezhda Popova untouchable during the critical phase of any intercept. On April 3, 1943, during her 11th mission of what would become an 18-sortie night, she detected a fighter approaching from the east, possibly alerted by the sound of its engine or the distinctive way searchlights tracked across the sky when ground control vectored fighters toward targets. She immediately throttled back to minimum power, dropped from 600 meters to less than 100, and descended into the ground clutter, where German radar lost resolution. The fighter made multiple passes, overshooting each time, the pilot growing increasingly desperate and frustrated. On the final attempt, Popova could see the German aircraft's wings wobbling as the pilot approached stall speed, the visible instability of an aircraft at the edge of controlled flight. The fighter was forced to abandon the intercept or crash into the Kuban steppe. This tactic, repeated across her 852 missions, proved the PO-2's slowness was its greatest weapon. German engineers calculated thrust, weight, speed, firepower. They calculated everything except one variable. You cannot intercept what flies slower than your minimum speed. And Nadezhda Popova flew slower than physics allowed Germans to chase. The stall speed paradox that had already frustrated Hauptmann Schmidt and dozens of pilots like him was only the first of three advantages the Night Witches possessed, advantages that would transform what appeared to be technical inferiority into tactical dominance. German fighters had been optimized through years of combat experience to intercept fast Soviet bombers. The Ilyushin Il-4 traveling at 260 miles per hour, the Petlyakov P-2 dive bomber capable of 330 miles per hour. The Junkers Ju-88 and Messerschmitt Bf-110 night fighters were designed to chase these aircraft down, pursue them across hundreds of kilometers, and destroy them with overwhelming firepower. The fundamental physics required maintaining minimum speed, or the aircraft would simply fall from the sky. At 300 miles per hour, cruising speed, overshooting a target traveling at 90 miles per hour became inevitable. Slowing to 150 miles per hour brought German pilots to dangerous proximity to their stall threshold of 120 miles per hour, where wings stopped generating lift and death became imminent. The PO-2 operated comfortably at 80 miles per hour in level flight, and could glide at 60 miles per hour with its engine producing zero power, creating an untouchable zone where German pilots physically could not engage. German training emphasized pursuit tactics, high-speed intercepts, aggressive closure rates. Nothing in Luftwaffe doctrine addressed precision slow-speed engagement with targets flying below your minimum survivable airspeed. Target acquisition at high differential speeds provided approximately 2 to 3 seconds of weapons lock opportunity. At a speed differential of 200+ miles per hour, establishing a firing solution, tracking the target, and delivering accurate fire became aerodynamically impossible. On March 15, 1943, Nadezhda Popova demonstrated this advantage on her 431st mission while targeting a German supply depot near Krimskaya. She detected the German fighter approximately 3 kilometers distant by the distinctive roar of its BMW radial engines cutting through the night air, a sound that every night witch learned to recognize with the same instinctive terror that prey animals recognize the approach of predators. Her immediate response followed the doctrine she had helped develop through 300 previous encounters. Throttle to minimum power, descending from 800 meters to 200 meters altitude, where ground clutter would confuse German radar and the darkness would provide concealment. Her airspeed dropped to 65 miles per hour. The aircraft was gliding more than flying, the control surfaces mushy and slow to respond, but stable. The German fighter made 4 distinct passes. The first came from her 7 o'clock position, high and fast, the pilot diving to build energy for the attack. He overshot by 300 meters before he could adjust his aim, his tracers disappearing into empty sky where Popova had been 5 seconds earlier. The second pass showed more patience, the pilot reducing speed, but his aircraft began to shudder visibly in the moonlight, wings wobbling as he approached stall conditions. He abandoned the attack and climbed to regain speed and control. The third and fourth passes showed increasing desperation, steep banks trying to circle back quickly, aggressive throttle management causing his engine to cough and surge, the visible frustration of a skilled pilot confronting an impossible tactical scenario. Each pass gave Popova additional time to adjust her course toward the target, to recalculate her bombing approach, to prepare for the attack run. She completed her bombing run while the German fighter burned fuel in futile intercept attempts, its tanks draining with each high-speed pass and energy-bleeding climb to reset for another attempt. This tactic, perfected over 852 missions and taught to every pilot in the 588th Regiment, transformed the PO2's slowness from liability into weapon. By this point, mission 431 of her eventual 852, the approach had become instinctive, automatic, a survival reflex burned into muscle memory through hundreds of repetitions. The result matched countless previous encounters. Target destroyed. PO2 returned safely to base. German pilot filing another report stating, target evasion successful through speed reduction below engagement threshold. The second advantage emerged from what Germans considered the PO2's greatest vulnerability, its construction from materials that belonged in furniture factories rather than military aircraft. When bullets from German machine guns struck aluminum fuselages of metal aircraft, the projectiles penetrated the thin skin, created clouds of secondary shrapnel from fragmented aluminum, and ricocheted inside the confined space until striking fuel lines, hydraulic systems, control cables, or crew members. German ammunition had been specifically designed for metal targets, explosive rounds that detonated on impact with hard surfaces, incendiary tracers that ignited fuel vapors, armor-piercing rounds that wasted tremendous kinetic energy, penetrating armor plating that existed on every modern combat aircraft. Against canvas aircraft, these carefully engineered bullets performed catastrophically poorly. The projectile struck fabric, passed completely through both entry and exit sides of the aircraft, and exited into open air, having transferred almost zero energy to the target. No metal to fragment meant no shrapnel. No confined fuselage meant no ricochet danger. No armor to penetrate meant armor-piercing rounds wasted their specialized capabilities on air. The wooden frame absorbed bullets by allowing them to pass through unless they directly struck a primary structural spar, and even then the wood typically deflected rather than shattered. Vital systems occupied perhaps 15% of the aircraft's total volume: the engine, the fuel tank, and the two-person crew. Canvas tears did not affect aerodynamic performance in any measurable way. The PO-2 flew with dozens of holes punched through its wings without noticeable handling degradation. Repairs required 30 minutes. Ground crew patched canvas with fabric and glue, a process no more complex than repairing a torn tent. Metal aircraft repairs required hours of welding, riveting, and structural analysis. German pilots were filing increasingly frustrated reports describing hits without kills, bullets striking targets without effect. The psychological horror of watching their tracer rounds pass completely through enemy aircraft that continued flying as if nothing had happened. During her 508th mission on April 28, 1943, Nadezhda Popova proved this advantage definitively while attacking a German artillery position that had been shelling Soviet infantry positions for 3 consecutive days. She approached at 600 meters altitude in bright moonlight, deliberately exposing herself to draw fire away from her wingman, who was approaching from a different vector. The German position possessed 2 quad-mount 20mm anti-aircraft guns, weapons capable of firing 1,800 rounds per minute, with explosive shells designed to destroy metal bombers. They opened fire when Popova was 1,200 meters distant, walking their tracers across the sky toward her aircraft. She maintained course and speed, refusing to take evasive action until the final moment before bomb release. The PO-2 absorbed hits like a sponge absorbing water. Ground crew counted 42 bullet holes after landing, 27 in the upper wing alone, creating a pattern that looked like deliberate perforation. 1 round had passed through the fuselage 3 centimeters behind Popova's seat, close enough that she felt the pressure wave and smelled the explosive residue. Another had destroyed the compass, filling the cockpit with broken glass and phosphorescent liquid. A third had punctured the fuel tank, but the self-sealing bladder had functioned, limiting fuel loss to less than 2 liters. 2 more had passed through the tail section, 1 on each side, creating perfectly aligned entrance and exit holes that mechanics later used to demonstrate the phenomenon to skeptical engineers. The ground crew's reaction upon inspection ranged from dark humor to genuine awe. They chalked numbers next to each hole like macabre decorations, compared the pattern to Swiss cheese, and debated which hole had come closest to killing her. The aircraft was deemed fully airworthy after 45 minutes of canvas patching and fuel bladder inspection. Popova flew 3 more missions that night in the same damaged aircraft, refusing to stand down despite the navigator's suggestion that they take a reserve PO-2. This particular aircraft, identification number 42, would carry her through 96 more missions before being retired due to accumulated structural fatigue. When asked by a war correspondent how she survived encounters that would have destroyed metal aircraft, Popova said, "In their metal planes, I would be dead. The bullets would bounce around inside until they found something important to break or someone important to kill. In our planes, bullets pass through like we're not even there. We're ghosts made of wood and fabric." But the third advantage proved most devastating to German morale and most effective at degrading their combat capability through systematic psychological warfare. German searchlight and anti-aircraft artillery systems relied fundamentally on acoustic detection technology, developed through decades of air defense evolution. Sound-ranging equipment triangulated engine noise to provide targeting coordinates for searchlights and guns. Standard defensive procedure followed predictable patterns. Acoustic sensors detected engine noise. Operators calculated bearing and distance. Searchlights activated to acquire visual contact. Anti-aircraft artillery opened fire on illuminated targets, and night fighters were scrambled to intercept survivors. The system was efficient, proven, responsible for thousands of Allied bomber kills. The Night Witches discovered a tactic that rendered this entire defensive infrastructure completely useless. A discovery that may have been accidental initially, but was refined through practice into devastating effectiveness. The approach worked through simple physics. First, approach the target area at 8,000 feet altitude with engines at full throttle, making maximum noise, ensuring Germans heard the aircraft and prepared all defensive measures. Second, at approximately 3,000 feet altitude and 3 miles from target, idle engines completely to 0 power. Third, glide in absolute silence for 5 to 6 minutes while German defenders searched empty sky for aircraft they could hear but no longer locate. Fourth, drop bombs before Germans realized aircraft were directly overhead. Fifth, restart engines only after bombs exploded and defensive fire began. The physics were straightforward. The POWs glide ratio was approximately 1 to 10, losing 1 foot of altitude for every 10 feet of forward travel. From 3,000 feet altitude, the aircraft could glide 30,000 feet, equivalent to 5.6 miles of horizontal distance. At 60 miles per hour glide speed, this meant 5.6 minutes of completely silent approach. The only sound was wind passing through canvas wings, a soft rustling that blended into natural night sounds and was utterly unlike the distinctive roar of aircraft engines. The psychological effect on German soldiers was profound. They would hear engines, prepare for attack, activate searchlights that found nothing, and then experience explosions from aircraft that were somehow invisible and silent. It violated their understanding of aerial warfare, their training, their equipment capabilities, their sense of control over the battlefield. On the night of February 23, 1943, when Nadezhda Popova flew her record-breaking 18 missions in a single night, she used this silent approach 13 times. On her 7th sortie of that historic night, she targeted a German command post near Novorossiysk, a concrete bunker housing staff officers responsible for coordinating artillery fire across the entire coastal sector. She approached with engines at maximum power, deliberately loud, announcing her presence. German defenders responded exactly as doctrine prescribed. Searchlights swept the sky, anti-aircraft guns fired ranging shots, soldiers rushed to defensive positions. At 2,800 feet altitude, Popova cut her engine completely. The sudden silence was absolute. She could hear her navigator Katya breathing behind her, hear the wind whistling through the control wires, hear German voices calling to each other on the ground below. "Where are the planes? I don't hear them anymore." Did they turn back? The POW descended in its silent glide, a ghost drifting over German positions while searchlights continued scanning empty sky 3,000 meters away, where the sound had originated. Popova could see German soldiers clearly in the moonlight, their faces turned upward, expressions confused and increasingly fearful as the engine noise failed to return. She dropped both 50-kilogram bombs directly on the command post from 400 meters altitude. The explosions illuminated dozens of faces looking up at her in shock, seeing the aircraft for the first time in the instant it killed them. 12 officers died in that strike, including an oberst responsible for coordinating counter-battery fire. Popova restarted her engine only after clearing the target area, the sound announcing her escape but providing no useful information for pursuit. She would repeat this silent approach technique on her 8th, 9th, 11th, 13th, 15th, 16th, and 17th missions of that night, perfecting the timing, learning exactly how much altitude she needed for different target distances, discovering that German defenders never adapted within a single night, because the tactic violated their fundamental assumptions about aerial warfare. When asked by a journalist how the Germans responded to the silent approach, she said, "We were ghosts they couldn't fight. They feared the silence more than the bombs because silence meant we controlled the engagement completely. They could only wait and hope we weren't targeting them specifically." German technical superiority on paper meant nothing in operational reality, a fact that Wehrmacht logistics officers were documenting with increasing alarm through after-action reports and resource allocation analyses. The Junkers Ju-88 possessed genuinely impressive specifications: 300 miles per hour maximum speed, 2,400 horsepower from twin BMW radial engines, Fuji 220 radar with 4-kilometer detection range, comprehensive radio communication systems, armor protection for crew, armament including 3 20mm cannons. The cost and production requirements matched these capabilities. $80,000 per aircraft, 3 months construction time requiring skilled labor, and precision manufacturing infrastructure available at only a handful of factories. Operational tempo for Ju-88 night fighters averaged 1 to 2 sorties per night maximum, limited by the complexity of the aircraft systems and the physical and mental exhaustion of coordinating a 4-person crew through high-stress combat operations. Maintenance between missions consumed 3 to 4 hours. Comprehensive systems checks, refueling requiring specialized equipment, rearming with precision-manufactured ammunition, mandatory crew rest periods to prevent fatal errors. Crew fatigue became a critical limiting factor. 4 men coordinating in a confined space under combat stress accumulated exhaustion rapidly. The average Ju-88 night fighter career lasted 40 to 60 missions before loss due to combat, mechanical failure, or mandatory crew rotation. Survival rates hovered around 60%, with many losses attributed to weather, navigation errors, and mechanical failures rather than enemy action. These statistics represented the culmination of German aeronautical engineering excellence applied to the night fighter mission. The POW-2 reality provided brutal contrast through its primitive simplicity. Specifications were agricultural grade, 94 miles per hour maximum speed, 100 horsepower from a single radial engine, no radar, no radio communication, no armor protection, crew of 2 women operating an exposed cockpit. Cost and production reflected this simplicity. $5,000 per aircraft, 3 weeks construction time requiring minimal skilled labor, produced in factories that manufactured furniture between military contracts. Operational tempo ranged from 8 to 18 sorties per night, limited only by pilot endurance, weather, and darkness hours available. Maintenance between missions required 7 minutes total, 4 minutes for refueling using hand pumps and fuel drums, 3 minutes for reloading bombs that were essentially modified artillery shells with external racks. Crew coordination involved 2 women who had flown together through hundreds of missions, developing instinctive communication that transcended the need for radio systems. The average Night Witch career exceeded 800 missions, with some pilots completing over 1,000 combat sorties. Survival rates reached 96.8%, with losses almost entirely from ground fire rather than fighter interception. The paradox was mathematically demonstrable and strategically devastating. More expensive, more sophisticated aircraft produced lower operational effectiveness, measured by sorties completed, targets destroyed, and resources expended per unit of enemy damage inflicted. Simpler, cheaper aircraft produced higher operational effectiveness across every metric that mattered for strategic impact. German advantage in technology had become a disadvantage in logistics, a reversal of fundamental assumptions that German doctrine could not accommodate. These statistics were embodied in Nadezhda Popova's operational record with precision that war correspondents and military analysts would study for decades afterward. On that record-breaking night of February 23, 1943, she began operations at 2200 hours and continued until 0530 hours, a 7.5-hour operational period during which she completed 18 complete mission cycles. The average cycle time was 25 minutes from takeoff to landing, to refueling, to reloading to next takeoff. Ground crew efficiency had reached levels where mechanics could prepare the aircraft faster than Popova could walk from her brief navigation check to the cockpit. Each mission carried 2 50-kilogram bombs, meaning she delivered 1,800 kilograms of high explosive that night, equivalent to the payload of 3 German medium bombers. German positions hit included 2 ammunition dumps, 1 vehicle repair depot, 1 artillery park, 2 infantry barracks, 1 fuel storage facility, and 11 mixed tactical targets. German casualties from her missions that single night were estimated at between 80 and 120 killed, with additional wounded uncounted and infrastructure damage exceeding 500,000 Reichsmarks. For comparison, the most accomplished Luftwaffe night fighter pilot on record flew a maximum of 4 sorties in one night, considered an exceptional achievement that earned official commendation. Popova's sustained operational tempo over 852 missions total meant she had completed the equivalent of 34 full American combat tours, since United States Army Air Force bomber crews were rotated home after 25 missions. By this point in the war, her 852 missions were becoming legendary, even among German soldiers, who had begun referring to specific Night Witch pilots by reputation, despite not knowing their names, calling them the ghost who flies every night, or the one who never misses. Wehrmacht logistics officers were recording a disturbing pattern in resource expenditure reports that contradicted every assumption about cost-effective warfare. German expenditure attempting to stop the Night Witches specifically, documented through quartermaster records and ammunition requisition forms, revealed catastrophic inefficiency. Anti-aircraft ammunition expenditure exceeded 2 million rounds fired at Night Witch aircraft, at an average cost of 50 Reichsmarks per shell, totaling 100 million Reichsmarks equivalent to 40 million United States dollars. Fighter sorties dedicated to intercepting night witches exceeded 1,000 attempts over 18 months of operations, at an operational cost of 500 Reichsmarks per sortie, including fuel, ammunition, maintenance, and crew time, totaling 500,000 Reichsmarks. Searchlight batteries numbered over 200 units deployed specifically for night defense in sectors where night witches operated, each requiring dedicated power generation, maintenance, and operator crews. Personnel assigned to counter-night harassment operations exceeded 5,000 soldiers who could have been deployed in offensive operations. Total German cost for defending against the night witches approached 50 million Reichsmarks. Soviet investment in the 508th Night Bomber Regiment told a radically different story. 40 PO-2 aircraft at $5,000 each equaled $200,000 total. Ammunition costs were a fraction of defensive ammunition expended against them. Personnel numbered 80 pilots and navigators plus minimal ground crew, totaling approximately 150 people. And total Soviet investment remained under $2 million United States dollars for the entire regiment's operational lifespan. The cost ratio was devastating. Germans were spending 25 Reichsmarks for every 1 Reichsmark Soviets spent, attempting to stop a threat that cost almost nothing to create. Effectiveness measured by confirmed kills made this worse. Germans achieved 0 confirmed fighter kills on Night Witch aircraft through aerial combat. Every Night Witch loss was attributed to ground fire, weather, or mechanical failure. The result was perfect asymmetric warfare, minimal investment producing maximum enemy resource drain, forcing Germans to dedicate massive defensive infrastructure against targets that cost almost nothing to field. Nadezhda Popova personally represented this asymmetric efficiency with mathematical precision that embarrassed German staff officers who analyzed the numbers. If German anti-aircraft batteries fired an average of 1,000 rounds attempting to hit her aircraft per mission, a conservative estimate based on ammunition consumption records, then her 852 missions meant approximately 850,000 rounds had been fired specifically at her. At 50 Reichsmarks per round, this totaled 42 million Reichsmarks spent attempting to kill one woman flying a wooden biplane that cost $5,000. The result of this investment: she survived every mission. Meanwhile, her bombs destroyed an estimated 34 tons of ammunition, 78 vehicles including trucks and armored cars, 42 artillery pieces, 6 fuel storage facilities, 9 command posts, and infrastructure whose value exceeded 80 million Reichsmarks. The value of German material she destroyed was approximately double what Germans spent trying to kill her. For comparison, the average United States Army Air Force bomber crew was rotated home after 25 missions, considered a full combat tour. Popova completed the equivalent of 34 full American tours of duty. She represented more combat sorties than entire squadrons of German night fighters flew in their operational careers. Her 852 missions made her one of the most cost-effective weapons in the Soviet arsenal, destroying more enemy material per ruble invested than artillery, tanks, or strategic bombers. German High Command was beginning to realize that killing women in wooden biplanes was costing more than those women were costing the Soviets, and Nadezhda Popova had no intention of stopping. As German High Command grappled with the resource drain documented in logistics reports, frontline intelligence was about to deliver a shocking revelation that would force them to confront an uncomfortable truth about their enemy and their own assumptions. On October 31, 1942, near Gudermes in the North Caucasus region, a rapid German armored advance overran a hastily evacuated Soviet airfield. The advance had been so swift that Soviet forces abandoned equipment, documents, and supplies in their retreat. Among the scattered papers, a Wehrmacht intelligence officer named Hauptmann Otto Becker discovered a flight roster for the 588th Night Bomber Regiment. The document listed pilot-navigator pairs with their mission counts and equipment assignments. Every single name was unmistakably female: Lieutenant Nadezhda Popova and Navigator Galina Brokbeltsova, Lieutenant Yevdokia Bershanskaya, and Navigator Maria Smirnova, Senior Lieutenant Irina Sabrova, paired with Navigator Nadia Studilina. Becker's initial assumption was clerical error, or Soviet propaganda materials accidentally mixed with operational documents. He cross-referenced the roster against captured pilot logs found in the same briefing tent. The same names appeared across hundreds of mission entries spanning 6 months of operations. Each log detailed targets, bomb loads, weather conditions, navigation routes. These were authentic operational records, not propaganda. Personnel files provided birth dates showing ages between 18 and 23 years old. Award citations mentioned specific raids and confirmed the feminine titles, and names matched combat actions Germans had documented themselves. The realization crystallized slowly, resisted by every assumption Becker had internalized through years of Wehrmacht service. These were actual combat pilots flying nightly raids, and every one of them was a woman. The report Becker sent up the chain of command was marked urgent, requires immediate verification, and created chaos at each level of review. The battalion commander who received it initially dismissed it as disinformation planted for German discovery, assuming Soviets anticipated the airfield capture. Within the same week, 2 more confirmations arrived from different sectors. A PO-2 shot down by ground fire near Krimskaya revealed a female pilot's body when recovery teams removed the helmet, and documents found on the aircraft confirmed Lieutenant Marina Chechneva of the 588th Regiment with over 200 missions logged. At division headquarters, intelligence officers attempted to rationalize the pattern as isolated exceptions, perhaps female ferry pilots accidentally caught in combat zones. That explanation collapsed when Army Group Intelligence compiled reports across 300 kilometers of front and found consistent patterns. The 588th Night Bomber Regiment, operational since May 1942, consisted entirely of female personnel from pilots to navigators to ground crew. In December 1942, Wehrmacht High Command received a comprehensive briefing from General Major Hans-Jürgen Stumpf, presenting photographic evidence, captured documents, prisoner testimonies, and cross-referenced mission reports. The room of senior Luftwaffe officers confronted irrefutable evidence. The same aircraft serial numbers appeared in raid reports spanning months, always operating from known 588th Regiment airfields, always following identical tactical patterns, and documentation conclusively identified the pilots as women. Intelligence had verified through multiple independent sources that the night harassment operations costing millions of Reichsmarks in defensive expenditure were being conducted by Soviet women flying obsolete training aircraft. The conclusion was unavoidable and deeply embarrassing. The revelation created a crisis within Wehrmacht command structure that transcended tactical concerns and struck at fundamental ideological assumptions about warfare, gender, and German military superiority. The disbelief was profound and persistent. Many officers demanded additional verification, insisting the evidence must be flawed or manipulated. The humiliation cut deeper than any tactical defeat because it meant elite Luftwaffe pilots trained at enormous expense in the world's most advanced fighter aircraft had been systematically beaten by women flying wooden crop dusters. This created an unsolvable propaganda problem. How could German command explain to their own troops and civilian population that their technological and doctrinal superiority had been negated by female Soviet pilots in obsolete aircraft? The ideological conflict was even more severe because Nazi doctrine explicitly defined women's roles as mothers and homemakers, excluded them from combat positions, and proclaimed Germanic racial and gender superiority as scientific fact. Operational reality had demolished these assertions. If Soviet women could accomplish this, what else had German leadership been catastrophically wrong about regarding enemy capabilities? Specific reactions revealed the depth of psychological impact. Multiple Luftwaffe pilots requested transfers to other theaters, rather than continue operations where their failures against female pilots might become known to their peers. Luftwaffe High Command issued directives suppressing information about pilot gender, fearing broader morale impact across the entire Eastern Front. Operational Order 4427, dated January 8, 1943, stated, "All references to enemy night bomber personnel in official reports shall employ standard military terminology without specific reference to gender." This directive issued to maintain operational focus and prevent unnecessary speculation that may impact troop morale. Violations will result in disciplinary action. The order was largely ineffective. Frontline soldiers' reactions differed from officer corps. They developed grudging respect mixed with superstitious fear. caring less about gender than about the nightly attacks that prevented sleep and destroyed supplies. The nickname Nachthexen, or night witches, spread rapidly through Wehrmacht ranks despite official discouragement, the term carrying connotations of supernatural threat that transcended normal military categories. Some German units began specifically requesting dedicated anti-night witch resources in requisition forms. Others refused to acknowledge gender in any context, focusing exclusively on tactical threat assessment, as if ignoring the fact would make it less humiliating. While German command struggled with the revelation and its implications for their worldview, Nadezhda Popova was flying her 574th mission, completely unaware that German intelligence had just confirmed her identity and gender through captured documents. She knew Soviet pilots had been captured. Intelligence briefings mentioned interrogations and warned about operational security. But whether Germans knew she was a woman made absolutely no difference to her mission planning or execution. This discovery period occurred several months after her record-breaking night of 18 missions on February 23, 1943, a feat that had already entered Soviet military legend and was being documented in classified German reports attempting to understand how one pilot could achieve such operational tempo. By the time Germans officially confirmed the 588th Regiment's all-female composition in their intelligence summaries, Popova had already completed over 500 of her eventual 852 missions, accounting for tons of destroyed German material and hundreds of enemy casualties. On the night of December 12, 1942, while Wehrmacht intelligence officers were still processing captured documents from Gutermes, she targeted a German supply convoy near Mozdok. The attack destroyed 7 trucks loaded with artillery ammunition and killed an estimated 23 soldiers when the explosions from secondary detonations ripped through the convoy staging area. When asked years later by a military historian whether she cared that Germans had discovered the pilots were women, she said, "We didn't fly to prove women could fight. We flew to kill fascists. Whether they knew we were women made no difference to our bombs. The only thing that mattered was the target burning." The discovery changed nothing operationally. The night witches continued flying, and Germans continued dying. After the war, Soviet and Allied interrogators collected testimonies from thousands of German prisoners during the systematic debriefing process that lasted from 1945 through 1947. When interrogators asked about Eastern Front experiences, particularly regarding night operations and defensive challenges, an unexpected pattern emerged in the responses. Even hardened Waffen-SS officers who remained defiant on most topics showed visible reaction when the subject of night witches arose, a combination of frustration, grudging respect, and something approaching superstitious dread. The consistency across hundreds of independent interviews from soldiers who had never communicated with each other suggested genuine shared experience rather than coordinated narrative. Oberleutnant Werner Hoffmann, a Ju-88 night fighter pilot from Nachtjagdgeschwader 4 captured near Berlin in April 1945, provided testimony that became representative of the night fighter pilot experience. His interrogation transcript recorded, "We received orders to intercept these aircraft in August 1942. Command didn't tell us they were women. We only learned after the war ended when your interrogators informed us. I attempted interception 17 times across 8 months. 17 failures. The aircraft were too slow for engagement. Every approach, my stall warnings would activate when I tried to match their speed. I would overshoot or I would risk stalling and dying. It was professionally humiliating. You train for years to master the Ju-88. You face British Lancaster bombers and develop tactics. You understand air combat doctrine. Then a wooden biplane makes you look like an incompetent student pilot. When I learned after surrender they were women, I had no words initially. My interrogator seemed to think this should make me feel worse, but that wasn't it. We couldn't catch them because physics wouldn't let us. Gender was irrelevant to the aerodynamics. They had somehow beaten the fundamental laws that governed air combat. Hauptmann Friedrich Steiner commanded a flak battery in eastern Ukraine, and his testimony addressed the ground defense perspective with similar frustration. My battery fired an estimated 40,000 rounds at these aircraft between September 1942 and January 1944. We achieved perhaps 4 confirmed hits across 16 months, possibly 3 or 4 more unconfirmed. They would approach with engines audible, We would calculate trajectory and prepare firing solutions. Then silence. Complete silence. We would fire at predicted positions based on last known heading and speed, but we were essentially shooting at ghosts. The sound would return only after bombs had already exploded on our positions. I submitted multiple reports requesting acoustic ranging equipment upgrades, searchlight reinforcement, anything that might improve our effectiveness. Nothing helped. The psychological effect on my men was severe. We began to fear the silence itself more than the explosions. Some men became paranoid, hearing phantom engine sounds. Learning after capitulation that they were women only added to the sense that we had fundamentally underestimated every aspect of this enemy. Our entire doctrine had been designed to fight what we expected the Soviets to field, and they fielded something we had never conceived as possible. The pattern in testimonies revealed consistent themes across hundreds of interviews despite geographical separation and lack of communication between prisoners. Nearly every testimony mentioned the silence and its profound psychological impact, describing it as supernatural or ghost-like. Failed interception attempts appeared in testimony after testimony, with fighter pilots describing identical experiences of stall warnings and impossible speed differentials. Almost universal shock manifested when interrogators informed prisoners that Night Witch pilots were women. Many initially accused interrogators of lying or propaganda. Several attempted to rationalize the information afterward, suggesting Soviet propaganda had exaggerated female involvement, or that only a small percentage were actually women. Others admitted more honestly that gender made no practical difference to combat effectiveness, that the tactical advantages were real regardless of who exploited them. The phrase, "we couldn't catch what we couldn't match in speed," appeared in variant forms across dozens of testimonies. Multiple prisoners mentioned specific Night Witch aircraft by visual identification markers, distinctive repair patch patterns on wings, certain tail number sequences, or peculiar flight characteristics. Some acknowledged directly that pre-war propaganda about Soviet technological and human inferiority had been comprehensively wrong, and the Night Witches proved this nightly. Some testimonies referenced Nadezhda Popova specifically, though most didn't know her name and identified her aircraft by visual markings or operational patterns. Lieutenant Klaus Richter, an infantry officer with the 198th Infantry Division captured at Sevastopol, provided detailed testimony about one particularly persistent Night Witch. There was one aircraft we learned to recognize in our sector. It had a distinctive pattern of canvas patches on both wings. Looked like irregular camouflage, but we realized it was accumulated battle damage repairs. This aircraft appeared over our positions with unusual frequency, perhaps 3 or 4 times weekly when weather permitted. We began calling it the Ghost because it always arrived in silence, always hit valuable targets, and we never came remotely close to shooting it down. I personally witnessed this aircraft's attacks 9 times between November 1942 and May 1943. On February 8th, it destroyed our forward ammunition depot, creating an explosion that killed 6 men and left us critically short of artillery rounds for 3 weeks. On March 22nd, it hit our battalion command post, killing our commander and 2 staff officers. The accuracy was uncanny. After the war, I learned from Soviet records published in a military history journal that this aircraft was likely Lieutenant Nadezhda Popova's assigned PO2. She had flown over 852 missions total during the war. We never came close to shooting her down. She was untouchable, and I mean that literally, not as exaggeration. Popova learned about German prisoner testimonies years after the war when Soviet military historians began compiling comprehensive records and interviewing German veterans for comparative analysis. Her response to learning that German soldiers had feared her specifically showed characteristic pragmatism. She continued flying missions at sustained tempo through the entire period, when Germans were being captured and interrogated, accumulating her final mission count without regard for enemy recognition or reputation. By war's end in May 1945, she had completed all 852 missions, including the legendary 18-sortie night that remained unmatched by any pilot in any Air Force. Her 852 missions became documented not just in Soviet military archives but in German testimonies, Allied intelligence summaries, and post-war historical analysis as representing one of the most remarkable individual combat records of the entire war. When asked decades later about her reaction to German testimonies describing fear and frustration, she said, "We did what needed doing. Whether they respected us or feared us or were humiliated by us was their concern, not ours. Our concern was victory, was destroying fascism, was protecting our country. The testimonies prove we succeeded." The testimonies confirmed what Germans had discovered too late. The night witches weren't anomalies or propaganda. They were among the most effective tactical weapons deployed on the Eastern Front, and Nadezhda Popova was among the deadliest of them all. When the war in Europe ended on May 9, 1945, Nadezhda Popova's final record stood as testament to what Germans had dismissed as impossible when Oberst Hartmann mocked women in crop dusters 3 years earlier. She had flown 852 combat missions, more sorties than entire bomber squadrons completed during the war. Her operational period spanned from June 1942 through May 1945, 35 months of nearly continuous combat flying. Calculating conservatively at 2 hours per mission, including flight time to target, bombing run, and return, she accumulated over 1,700 flight hours in combat conditions. Each mission typically carried 200 kilograms of bombs, meaning she personally delivered approximately 170 tons of high explosives onto German positions. She survived the entire war without being shot down by enemy action, though her aircraft absorbed hundreds of bullet holes, and she endured multiple forced landings due to mechanical failures and battle damage. The Soviet Union awarded her the Gold Star of Hero of the Soviet Union, the nation's highest military decoration, along with the Order of the Red Banner, Order of the Red Star, and multiple campaign medals. Her 18 missions in a single night on February 23, 1943, remained unmatched by any pilot in any air force throughout the entire war, a record of sustained operational tempo that defied human endurance limits. The physical toll was permanent. Severe frostbite scarring on her face and hands from thousands of hours in open cockpits at sub-zero temperatures, partial hearing loss from engine noise, and chronic back problems from the physical stress of repeatedly climbing in and out of cockpits while wearing heavy flight suits. The psychological resilience required to fly 852 missions, knowing each sortie could end in death from ground fire, mechanical failure, or weather, exceeded what military psychologists considered sustainable. 32 of her comrades in the 588th Regiment died during the war, their deaths witnessed by survivors who then climbed back into their POWs and continued flying. To understand the magnitude of 852 missions, comparison illuminates what raw numbers obscure. The most accomplished German night fighter pilots flew 40 to 60 missions before being killed, wounded, or rotated to training duties. Werner Hoffmann, whose testimony appeared in Soviet interrogation records, flew 17 intercept attempts against night witches alone across his entire career and considered himself experienced. The United States Army Air Force rotated bomber crews home after 25 missions, considering this a complete combat tour worthy of medals and recognition. Popova completed the equivalent of 34 full American tours without rotation, without rest, without the promise of going home. Average Soviet male bomber pilots flew between 150 and 300 missions before death or war's end. The 588th Regiment's average was 500 to 600 missions per pilot, already extraordinary. Popova exceeded her own regiment's average by 40%. Her 852 missions represented more combat sorties than some entire bomber groups accumulated collectively. At 2 hours per mission, she spent 71 complete days airborne in combat. At 200 kilograms per mission, her 170 tons of bombs destroyed an estimated 12 ammunition dumps, 47 vehicles, 6 fuel storage facilities, countless infantry positions, and caused estimated German casualties exceeding 300 killed with many more wounded. Every calculation demonstrated the same conclusion. Popova's operational record represented one of the most sustained combat performances in aviation history, achieved in an aircraft Germans considered too primitive to matter, by a woman they initially refused to believe was flying combat missions at all. The 588th Night Bomber Regiment's collective record validated Soviet High Command's controversial decision to deploy women in combat aviation despite skepticism from Soviet military traditionalists and mockery from German intelligence. The regiment flew approximately 23,000 combat sorties between May 1942 and May 1945, delivering over 3,000 tons of bombs onto German positions across the Eastern Front. Conservative estimates place German casualties directly attributable to night witch attacks at over 5,000 killed or wounded, with exponentially higher numbers affected by disrupted supplies, destroyed infrastructure, and degraded morale. The regiment destroyed hundreds of ammunition dumps, thousands of vehicles, and countless installations whose loss forced German logistics into increasingly vulnerable configurations. Operating continuously for 3 years without significant operational pause, the Night Witches maintained pressure that Wehrmacht defenders could never fully counter. Regiment casualties totaled 32, killed from approximately 80 pilots and navigators, a survival rate of 96.8% that dramatically exceeded conventional Soviet bomber units, where survival rates ranged from 40 to 60%. The cost effectiveness was staggering. The entire regiment cost approximately $2 million to field, train, and maintain, while inflicting damage Wehrmacht quartermaster records valued at over $50 million in destroyed material alone, not counting operational disruption costs. German expenditure attempting to counter the Night Witches exceeded 125 million Reichsmarks, according to compiled logistics reports, creating a cost ratio where Soviets spent 1 ruble and Germans spent 60 attempting to neutralize that investment. German fighters achieved 0 confirmed aerial kills of Night Witch aircraft, despite over 1,000 dedicated intercept attempts. Nearly all regiment losses came from anti-aircraft ground fire, not air combat, validating the tactics that exploited stall speed paradox and made conventional fighter interception impossible. But numbers alone don't capture the strategic value the Night Witches provided beyond immediate material destruction. The psychological warfare component degraded German combat effectiveness through systematic sleep deprivation that medical officers documented in unit health reports as reducing alertness and increasing mistakes. Resource diversion forced Wehrmacht to assign over 5,000 soldiers to air defense duties who could otherwise have fought on front lines where manpower shortages were critical. Tactical disruption of supply lines forced German logistics to route convoys through longer, more vulnerable paths, increasing fuel consumption and transit time while supplies deteriorated. Propaganda value within the Soviet Union was immense. Proof that Soviet women could fight effectively boosted civilian morale and validated the total war mobilization that put women in factories, hospitals, and combat units. German intelligence failures and doctrinal rigidity stood exposed. The Night Witches revealed how prejudice and assumption create exploitable vulnerabilities that tactical innovation can leverage. The asymmetric warfare model demonstrated that irregular tactics executed with determination could achieve strategic impact, disproportionate to the forces employed. Marshal Georgy Zhukov noted in his war memoirs published in 1969, "The Night Witches achieved strategic impact disproportionate to their numbers or resources. They cost us almost nothing and cost the Germans everything they spent trying to stop them. This is the essence of effective warfare." The 508th Regiment proved that technological superiority matters less than tactical innovation, that determination can overcome engineering advantages, and that underestimating any enemy based on prejudice creates fatal weaknesses. Nadezhda Popova's 852 missions embodied this principle in the most personal, dangerous, and effective way possible. After the war ended, Nadezhda Popova faced challenges far different from night combat, but equally demanding in their own way. Initial recognition came immediately. Hero of the Soviet Union ceremonies in Moscow, parades where she marched with other decorated veterans, speeches at rallies celebrating victory over fascism. But returning to civilian life after 3 years of nightly combat flying proved psychologically difficult. She had trouble sleeping without the rhythm of mission cycles structuring her nights. Silence made her anxious rather than peaceful. She returned to aviation as a flight instructor, teaching new generations of Soviet pilots, unable to imagine life disconnected from aircraft. In 1946, she married Semyon Kravchenko, a fellow combat pilot she'd known during the war, and they had 2 sons. She spoke occasionally about her experiences but found that people who hadn't lived through combat couldn't truly understand the psychological toll of flying 852 missions, knowing each could be her last. The camaraderie with surviving squadron mates remained strong. They gathered annually to remember the 32 who died and to marvel that they themselves survived. Soviet recognition fluctuated with political winds. Stalin's government honored some war heroes while suppressing others whose prominence threatened his cult of personality. Popova received official recognition but never achieved the public prominence some male aces enjoyed. She continued advocating for women in military aviation, arguing that capability mattered more than gender, though Soviet military establishment remained largely traditionalist. She died on July 8, 2013, at age 91 in Moscow, one of the last surviving night witches. Russian Air Force officers attended her funeral. Her hometown of Donetsk named a street in her honor, though later conflict would erase many such commemorations in that region. For decades, the night witches remained virtually unknown in the West, their story dismissed as Soviet propaganda or simply never encountered by historians focused on Western Front operations. During the Cold War, Western military analysts who encountered references to all-female Soviet bomber units often assumed the accounts were exaggerated or fabricated for ideological purposes. The 1980s and 1990s glasnost period allowed more accurate stories to emerge as Soviet archives opened and veterans could speak more freely. By the late 1990s and early 2000s, Western historians gained access to both Soviet military records and German archives, allowing cross-verification that proved the Night Witch's operational record was documented fact, not propaganda. German testimonies from prisoner interrogations validated Soviet accounts with remarkable consistency, eliminating doubt about the regiment's composition and effectiveness. Books began appearing, Bruce Miles's Night Witches in 1981, followed by academic histories and popular accounts that brought the story to audiences who had never heard of the 588th Regiment. Documentary films in the 2000s featured interviews with surviving pilots, now elderly women recounting their youth spent dropping bombs on Wehrmacht positions. Museums incorporated Night Witch exhibits, particularly the Central Air Force Museum in Moscow, which displayed an original PO2 and documented the regiment's history with photographs, maps, and personal artifacts. Monuments appeared in Russia commemorating the regiment, schools were named after prominent pilots, and the story entered Russian cultural memory as symbol of wartime sacrifice and female capability. Western recognition grew more slowly but accelerated in the 2010s as feminist historians highlighted the Night Witches as examples of women's combat effectiveness. Though this sometimes oversimplified the story into modern political narratives the pilots themselves might not have recognized. The story of Nadezhda Popova and the Night Witches transcends its historical moment and offers lessons applicable far beyond the specific circumstances of the Eastern Front in World War II. About warfare itself, the Night Witches demonstrated that asymmetric tactics intelligently applied can defeat overwhelming technological superiority. That psychological impact sometimes produces strategic effects exceeding physical damage. That innovation matters more than resource abundance, and that underestimating any enemy based on assumptions rather than evidence creates exploitable vulnerabilities. About human capacity and prejudice, the Germans' fundamental assumptions about gender roles and aircraft primitiveness blinded them to real threats until those threats had already inflicted catastrophic damage. Their prejudice created tactical vulnerabilities that Soviet commanders exploited ruthlessly. The principle applies universally. Dismissing threats based on preconceptions rather than capabilities invites defeat. What appears to be weakness may be carefully disguised strength, and the enemy you mock is often the enemy you don't understand. About determination and resilience, flying 852 combat missions required extraordinary psychological strength beyond physical courage. Each mission carried real risk of death from ground fire, mechanical failure, weather, or simple exhaustion-induced error. Choosing to continue flying after witnessing 32 comrades die, after surviving bullet holes and forced landings, after enduring frostbite and hearing loss and chronic pain, required refusing to quit even when quitting would have been justified and understandable. About physics and engineering, the Night Witches proved that sometimes simple design defeats complex systems, that understanding operational environment matters more than raw specifications, that constraints force innovation in ways abundance never does, and that the right tool for any job isn't necessarily the most advanced tool, but rather the tool that best fits the specific requirements. The PO2's primitiveness was its strength. Canvas didn't explode like metal. Slowness became untouchability. Silence became psychological weapon. German engineers calculated thrust ratios and horsepower and speed differentials, but they never calculated what happened when their minimum survivable speed exceeded their enemy's maximum combat speed. The German officers who laughed at women in crop dusters that February night in 1943 never lived to understand what Nadezhda Popova proved across 852 missions: that courage doesn't require the finest equipment, that skill can overcome raw power, and that determination makes physics itself bend to tactical necessity. Her 18 missions in a single night weren't just a record of endurance. They were proof that the most sophisticated calculations mean nothing against an enemy who refuses to fight by your rules. The Germans built faster aircraft, more powerful engines, advanced radar systems, and comprehensive doctrine based on technological supremacy. They calculated speed ratios and firepower advantages and resource efficiency with Prussian precision. They calculated everything except the one variable that mattered most. They couldn't intercept what flew slower than their minimum speed, couldn't shoot what their bullets passed through without damage, couldn't hear what glided in silence, and couldn't defeat what they'd already dismissed as impossible. And in wooden biplanes held together with canvas and wire, aircraft that belonged in museums rather than battlefields, the night witches proved that sometimes the most dangerous weapon isn't the most powerful one. It's the one your enemy never sees coming until it's already destroyed everything you thought was safe.